I'm going to introduce Mary again because I prepared something and I'm going to say it wildly. Mary Midgley was born on September the 13th, 1919. Her mother came from the Borders. Although her grandfather was an engineer, and like a lot of Scottish engineers, she just told me he ended up in London, so we won't go into that. Her father was an Anglican priest. She went up to Somerville College, Oxford in 1938 to read Greats. After Oxford, she spent time as a civil servant and as a teacher. She married Geoffrey Midgley, also a philosopher, in 1950. They then moved to Newcastle, where they both taught philosophy at the university. She didn't publish her first book, Beast and Man, till she was 59, but the flow has continued since then and has established her as a preeminent and provocative thinker in the dangerous borderland between philosophy, science, religion, and ethics, all of which we'll dip into tonight. As you've just heard, she's received the Edinburgh Medal for her contribution to the well-being of society. So it's an enormous honor to have her here tonight. And my plan is for us to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for Q&A from the floor. And Mary, I'd like to start with a few questions about your life before we get into your work. Tell us a little bit about your parents and how significant was it being what the Americans call a preacher's kid?
Yes, well, my father, Tom Scrutton, was not what you'd call a standard parson or preacher. His father was an eminent lawyer and intended him, because he was the bright one, to become the same. My father, Tom, was brought up with very little religion at all, but in his teens, somehow he got it. I should have asked him for more, but I never have. He got it. And he nerved himself and said to this rather alarming father, "I'm sorry, Father, I don't want to be a lawyer. I want to be a parson." "Oh," said his father, "all right." And very seldom spoke to him again. So he was on his own, but I mean, so something was coming up. And he became a parson, and in 1916, he arranged to be a chaplain and was sent to the front, where he found himself having to explain to dying men why they were dying, what they were dying for. This was the formative experience of his life. It absolutely appalled him, and he became a sort of all-purpose pacifist who did all kinds of peace work from then on. Became very friendly with Vera Brittain, who was doing the same thing. And that sort of was the center of his life. So that's the life which I and my brother grew up with. And it certainly wasn't being a preacher's kid in the sense of being in a little group which was separate from everybody else. He worked as a parson, as parsons do. But it was the background.
Given that obviously a passionate radical man following a passionate radical version of Christianity, how did you yourself relate to that kind of family business? I mean, did you have a crisis with it? Did you evolve out of it, or?
Well, his general views seemed to me to be very good. I thought his political views were jolly good. He was a kind of sensible kind of socialist and internationalist and all those things. But I kind of never picked up on what obviously should be central in such a situation, a direct relation with God. I knew I was told he was there and I ought to be sort of saying something to him, but he was not a figure in my life and I couldn't make it. So I went on, yes, I was sort of going to church quite happily and living with this as a part of the background of life. But I never did pick up, and I still have not picked up, a clear vision of the universe in which one says, yes, that's got up there, you know. And as time has gone on, I'm not sure that, as it were, this is necessary, because people apprehend these things in different ways. And I certainly have no sort of sense that Christianity is based on a mistake. I mean, the ethics of it appear to be quite right, and the idea that you should love everybody and should treat them as such is very, basic to me still. But it still doesn't take the form which it's, I suppose, supposed to take. So that's my situation.
We'll probably come back to other ways of being religious. I think God gets talked about too confidently anyway. You went up to Oxford in 1938, where you studied alongside Iris Murdoch and a number of other remarkable women who made an impact on philosophy around that time: Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foot, and Mary Warnock, whom I know. And you said this was because so many of the male students had to leave to fight in the war. And you've said this, which I love: I do think that in normal times, a lot of good female thinking is wasted because it simply doesn't get heard.
Yeah.
Are things better for females today? Are they being heard better than then?
Well, you see, it's quite interesting. A number of people have commented on this fact that there were a number of who went to Oxford with me and did made good. Since then, they don't seem to be coming up in the same sort of way. Well, if you are present at a typical philosophical discussion, along with a number of very keen American graduate students, you can see how nobody gets a word in edgeways. And if by chance they do get a word in edgeways, nobody takes any notice of it. I mean, I don't think one can exaggerate the extent to which they are not heard. It's partly a matter of simply the loudness of the voice. You may think you can hear my voice easily, but if you had a few of these people here, you wouldn't. I don't know how much it matters, but I do think it's unfortunate, and it's only part of a change in academic life altogether, away from the personal, away from the direct expression of views, towards getting all the details right and being able to prove things and so forth, which I think is altogether very unfortunate. But I have done all I can, as it were. I don't think I could be going back and shouting at people. I shout in print.
A lovely American writer, my daughter gave me this book for my Christmas. It's called Mansplaining. Mansplaining, the fact that men have a compulsion to explain things all the time. Football, how engines work, and women do less of it. I don't explain anything. I don't understand anything. So it may well be part of that men do seem to have a lot to say, don't they? And not always to the point. Let's go back to Oxford, a final question. You didn't finish your doctorate on Plotinus's view of the soul, thank God, and you said it was a lucky escape. Do you think that universities today have kind of fetishized the doctorate? I mean, they got it from America, didn't they?
They got it from America.
And does it account for the desiccated quality of university life, do you think?
I'm afraid so. I mean, I should also say that I wasn't working in the sort of way that would have been required to get a doctorate. I wasn't, it didn't enable me to dig into Plotinus and what Plotinus was interested in the right sort of way, because I was always looking for something which hadn't been done yet, you see, and contradicting something that somebody had already said. And my supervisor meant well, I'm sure, but wasn't able to get me through that one. So I have continued extremely interested in philosophy, and I wish I'd read some more Plotinus now I think about him, because I think he's very good. But like a lot of people, having taken up a topic which interested me, I went off and did it in other ways, rather than completing it. And I mean, what keeps happening to people now when they do doctorates, they get, as it were, an option between doing more or less the whole of the subject that they're interested in, and having their thesis referred, because there's something here that isn't completely proved, you see, and chopping off a little bit. They can get through quite easily by chopping off a little bit. So the academic world increasingly is consisting of people who chopped off a little bit. And I think this is very unfortunate. I really do. Yeah.
Is it because, one more question before we go on to your work, about universities, I've noticed that they've increasingly become part of the global market economy rather than places of learning for its own sake. I mean, it's happened in theology. I know a guy who's called the Rainmaker. He's a conservative evangelical scholar, and he's called the Rainmaker because he brings in thousands of American evangelical postdoctoral students, and they fill that university with cash. And he's a scholar with them, but the thing that strikes me is that they seem to have positioned him there for market reasons. I mean, am I wrong? Is this not kind of happening there? Yeah.
I'm afraid in a marketing world, this goes over far too easily. And by, as it were, natural selection, the people who can do this come up at the top, don't they?
Yeah. Let's leave the universities alone. Let's go on to philosophy now. You've said of philosophy that it's like plumbing. You only notice it when something's gone wrong. And one of the things that I think has gone wrong is the scientism that sees the universe as a machine. Francis Crick, great man, has said a silly thing, I think, that our sense of personal identity is no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their attendant molecules. And that includes what we're doing. We're not really here tonight. We don't exist. I mean, we're just the thrumming of a machine, aren't we? So respond to that kind of neurological reductionism. It's very strong in science today, isn't it?
Well, what it is saying science is top, isn't it? You know, it's a status claim, seems to me, because what they're saying is wrong with our own consciousness and the thoughts that we have all the time. They are not part of any sort of scientific conclusion that you can state. They're part of the real world. And there is, you see, a perverse kind of philosophy at the basis of this, a metaphysic which is materialist in the sense it says there is nothing except matter, which is chemicals. Not as it were solid things like tables, but chemicals. That's all there is really, because that's what we talk about, and what we talk about must be what matters, so to speak. I think it's very potty, and you see what Crick does is throw this off at the beginning of his book, go very quickly into a lot of more detailed stuff, come back a little later and say the scientific account of human beings is that all our thinking can be explained by the movement of our brain cells. You don't explain the thinking in that sort of way. I mean, if you look at a bit of thinking, like what Einstein's theories, you see, and ask somebody to explain it, and they say, well, you see, this and that went to the left and went to the right, and so forth. It's absolutely not relevant at all. And why don't they say it's not relevant? They don't see it because they are fixated on this set of patterns which constitute a science, which is indeed, you know, all right and quite useful. They're fixated on that as if it were the only real thing. And I really think it's quite important, what has lately been pointed out, that the more obsessive you get, the more the left-hand side of your brain is active. The left-hand side does all the detailed thinking, And the left-hand side doesn't know that something else is needed as well. The right-hand side puts it in context, looks for the whole in which it's only a part, looks for the background of the world, which has to be there even when these physical things like brain cells are moving. And if you don't encourage your right brain to do this, you can get completely stuck with the left brain because by its nature, it isn't outward looking. You see, it doesn't know that it doesn't know everything. I'm not sure if I ought to be launching on this because it's not everybody's cup of tea, but I think it's a very illuminating fact. And that's science, right?
Yeah. You had a still relating to this, scientism as such really gets your goat going, and you had a celebrated punch-up with Richard Dawkins, which you then slightly apologized for because you did you went after him. Tell us a little bit about that. I mean, I know it comes up every time you talk to anyone, but Richard comes to this festival quite often. I've had conversations with him. Have had a kind of an ambivalent feeling about him. It was about the selfish gene, but he also does represent, in a sense, some of the other things you're talking about. So tell us a wee bit about that episode in your life.
Well, what happened was this. When I wrote Beast and Man, I took a lot of trouble to read E.O. Wilson's Sociobiology, which is a rather reductive way of thinking, but quite, to my view of mind, quite a respectable one, and I knew where that was. And I hadn't even read The Selfish Gene. I thought, oh, well, that'll be another example of the same stuff. When I did read it, I was profoundly shocked, and what profoundly shocked me was the drama that was being put in. You see, all this about Chicago gangsters, and dramas, as it were, whole novels about the gene and what it would do, treating it as an agent, as a creature that was taking charge. And you see, what I now think is this caught on so well because this was the age of Thatcher and Reagan. Selfishness was the latest thing. It was thought to be very good for the country and the civilization and everybody else. And all these myths, these little stories in the book Selfish Gene were on that side and were saying, yes, of course, all motivation is self-interest, and you would be very silly if you were to try to follow anything else. So I was appalled. And in a state of fury, I wrote a rather cross article, which appeared in Philosophy to this effect. And a little bit of controversy followed.
A little bit of controversy, my God, it became a... It was a Mike Tyson thing, yeah.
Dawkins picked up the idea that I hadn't read The Selfish Gene. He picked this up from a Swedish biologist to whom I had told the stories. I just told it to you. But he picked it up wrong, and he went about for a time saying that I never read The Selfish Gene, about which I had written so much. Now, the article that I wrote about it contained 6 or 7 long quotations from the book, you see, and were quite detailed about the book. Eventually, I wrote to Dawkins and said, this won't do, it didn't happen, did it? And he checked with this Swedish biologist and said, no, it didn't. But since that time, I have to say, he's gone on saying it again. And what this shows is he is deeply identified with this creed of really self-interest, which is the myth, the vision that inspired The Selfish Gene. It isn't the science that is concerned. The Selfish Gene, of course, has some perfectly good science in it. But it's the dream, the motivation which he was illustrating. And you see, as time has gone on, Thatcherism has become a little less popular to the rest of us.
God, certainly up here, yeah. Yeah.
Quite a lot of things turn out not to work. And time goes on. I mean, this row...
Mary, don't do that. You're clicking your speaker.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Can we? I like the no. I mean, the fact that science is never done in a vacuum. It's done within a context, and the context in which that came out was a particular attitude to the market. So, isn't it fascinating that scientists are not the pure objective creatures they think they are?
No, of course they're not, and why would they be? This should be no surprise, but it does need saying. And when one comes across a lot of boasting about how science is the only source of truth, people are ignoring that, which is really pretty obvious. I mean, if one knows any individual scientist, one knows they have their own motives.
Yeah.
Why would they have? So, I mean, when I oppose scientism, which I frequently do, I really am not opposing science. I hope you get that quite clear. Science itself does not call for, no science calls for this exclusive claim to say that it's telling you the whole of what's going on. There are a lot of different sciences which overlap, and we have to treat them realistically.
Do you think that the biological sciences are more prone to this kind of authoritative speaking than, say, the physicists, who are dealing with such indeterminate stuff that they're far less committed to this kind of certainty?
Yes. I mean, physicists, they are officially simply talking about physical matter and what particles do, don't convey a message. But if they're talking, biologists who are talking about living creatures do convey a message. And the language in which they put it is often very misleading because it is designed to show that, as it were, the brain cells are the only thing that's happening. I mean, particularly people who think that only humans have minds and animals are unconscious, which is a doctrine that really got into science, I'm afraid, from Descartes in the 1600s and has stayed since. People who think that talk about what animals do as if nothing were happening except that their brain cells are moving. Now, this is obviously absurd. I mean, we concede now, we agree that we have developed out of animals which were rather similar to other animals. In the process of doing that, we acquired these capacities to do things which only humans do, which a lot of things which not only humans do, like being nice to our children and so forth. We acquired these capacities and tendencies, and they are just as real as what happens inside our heads. It is not a truth that, as it were, the little small things are real, but the whole person isn't, so to speak. And this unwillingness, I'm coming back to this point, I think, that this unwillingness to think of the whole being as in charge is very typical of this kind of trouble. Can I get back to Lovelock? Because
I was just going to come to that. It's sad that Richard Lovelock, who should have been here tonight, was unable to come. Jim, sorry, I'm a piece of egotism there. I'm giving him my name. Lovelock, James Lovelock, should have been here, but he's got pneumonia. But let's celebrate him and your relationship with him, and tell us about him. Tell us about Gaia and its implications for the way that we should be living and responding to each other and to the rest of the earth. It's a small subject.
The idea of Gaia is the idea of the earth as a whole organism, a whole which acts as a whole, both the earth and the living things on it, not just a scene in which a lot of little particles are doing this or that, but an active agent, developing agent. Lovelock put this forth in the early 70s, I think, or a bit before. And at once when I saw it, I thought, God, that's right. You know, yes, it makes sense of the whole of life, the evolution of everything, and of all the living things, and of the earth that it grows out of. But most scientists objected to it and rejected it. And one thing that made them reject it, I think, is the name. Lovelock was looking for a name and didn't find one. And his friend, the novelist, what's the fellow's name? Suggested Gaia, which is the Greek goddess of the earth. And at once, Lovelock saw that's pretty good, yes, and he took it up. But the myth that this suggests, the world in which something like a planet can act as a whole, is absolutely contrary to the myth that scientists are in the habit of accepting, because they're in the habit of accepting atomism. That is the idea that only the smallest particles actually do anything. This is a very odd idea if you think about it, because when you think about the incredibly elaborate world which has been built up, the idea that these little protons and so forth could have all the idea of that in their heads, you know, and could know how to do it, isn't at all sensible. But it's a creed which scientists accept without noticing what a big supposition it is and why they should make it. So he had a lot of trouble. For quite a long time, people sometimes accepted some of it and said, oh, but it's exaggerated, isn't it? And they tended to treat it as a bit of a joke. The conference on Gaia, which was held, in the 1950s, I was there, included a lot of detailed stuff about what happens in the atmosphere at sea and so forth, but it also included a talk on the philosophy of this by me and a talk on the politics of it by a political scientist. And on the first evening at supper, we were talking about this program, and I said, well, I rather wish that these could have been at the beginning, or in fact, both at the end. And the chap opposite said, oh no, I want something light at the end, I get tired.
Oh.
To think about what it all meant, to put it in the context of a cosmos, really, was quite out of the way for them, and they still find it extremely hard. And I'm told that what is it? Some eminent philosopher has just been dizzy who was saying, expressed disapproval of this.
John Gray.
No, sorry, John Gray's in favour of it.
Yes, yeah.
Who's the fellow who's...
Oh, Nagel.
No.
Simon Blackburn?
That's right.
Oh, no, he had...
Yes. Has apparently said that it ought to be, as it were, suppressed.
He said that of Nagel's book on the fact that the universe might have a purpose.
That's right.
And he said he'd put that book in the index. Does he also knock a Gaia theory? I suppose he would.
It's part of the same.
Yeah.
Yes, the biologists don't go for it. You see, funny thing about biology, they never want to talk about the concept of life. The standard dictionary of biology doesn't have an entry on the life. The because it's very, you see, you can't think about life if you've got the world divided into these little particles. This sort of nothing. It don't make sense.
Mary, can we talk about some of the solid implications and imperatives that would flow from Gaia theory? I mean, I know you're a friend of Richard Maybe. He gets very passionate about this and believes animals have agency. He talks about birds doing jazz, improvising musically, and we think that they're all programmed like we are. Talk about that, because it apart from giving us more wonder about the universe, it would give us more respect for the other creatures, wouldn't it?
Certainly. I mean, we often do respect the other creatures regardless of this alleged creed. But still, the creed is always getting in the way of our recognition of them. So I really want to shout a bit about the importance of love. What I think this is a terribly useful idea, and it was resisted for very bad reasons. I was present at the Lovelock's 90th birthday party, and I was all set to hear people say, yes, this is the greatest biologist since Darwin. Nobody did. You see, they all talked about the other silly things that people talk about birthday parties. But I've been wanting to say this ever since, so to speak. You see, the trouble with this, with Darwin, is that people did take it that he had shown the whole business of evolution as one performance very well, and made a fairly convincing story about it. But then people took it up in individualist terms. They saw it as a competition, whereby the next stage would be determined by a fight between two sorts of organism, and one getting the better of the other. This was all very Thatcherite, I think, very market-minded. They have concentrated on natural selection, which is only the way in which, as it were, the next step is reached. But what needs to be accounted for, you see, is the immense development, the positive development of all these life forms. And you can't account for that by saying that each one got the better of the other one. So why was the other one there, you see? I think that the idea of the Earth as a whole, both it and the creatures on it, operating as a whole makes sense. And of course all sorts of detailed sections of this came forward, and the most striking one is the, what is it, something iodide, the atmosphere, the atmospheric things. Water vaporizes, and it's got various chemicals in it, which set up little grains of matter, around which the water then collects. So it comes down as rain. If that wasn't happening, if something iodide, what is it?
It was Mars, didn't he? Said there couldn't be life on Mars.
No memory, but yes, if that wasn't there, it wouldn't happen. And there are a lot of things of that kind, you see, which seem to be happening, not because somebody put them there, nor because they prevailed over some alternative, but because the Earth is just working that way, yes, and some of it is about the behaviour of the currents of known stuff, what's it all called, that's underneath, that is necessary, that's going on and brings up the volcanic eruptions, which keep things going and so forth. This, it seems, is facilitated by the living things whose chemicals are now getting down there and are making things happen. Now, this is a terribly crude way of talking, but I am summarising stuff which is solid science, which has emerged partly because of Lovelock's efforts. And you see, the difficulty that our scientists have in admitting this is due to their having decided that matter hasn't got a purpose, and all there is matter. You see, there's just all these chemicals, and they aren't trying to do anything. I think a lot of it is simply a reaction against religion, the idea that they can get rid of the idea that God did it. But you see, that isn't the only idea that can come up here. You don't have to have an agent from outside saying to the earth, produce volcanoes or whatever. If it isn't the nature of the earth that it produces volcanoes, then this will go on.
The jump that makes it difficult for me, I mean, I've read Steve Jones and all this, the chemical soup, the sea, the volcanoes, lightning, and life forms emerge and they start. It's the jump into mind that, into thinking, thinking animation that still kind of keeps me poised in a kind of religious wonder. I mean, it is weird that after about 14, the jump, yeah. Well, the slow, I mean, but at some point, something must have noticed it was thinking.
Well, I think so, but gradually, yes. Now, you know, Simon John Conway Morris.
Yep.
I think his thoughts are extremely good and interesting here. What he points out is the convergence of different living things towards a gradual increase of perception and thought. From obviously a very low level at which you begin to see something like an eye because you respond a little bit to the light and that kind of thing. But it's not just that all these different items suddenly manifest some new capacity or other, but that there is a tendency towards that sort of capacity, which is a terribly slow process. And of course you're right to say no jump. But if one asks oneself at what stage do you going to call it mind, one is in big trouble because of course we don't know what it feels like. We can't look at it from the inside. And if what people tend to do is say, well, there isn't anything like me suddenly reciting a poem. You see, as it were, ants don't recite a poem, so they don't know what's going on. And the discontinuity between us and insects is a difficulty. But if you think about ancestors and termite nests, some sort of thought goes into this.
They're a kind of group mind, aren't they?
Sure,
yeah.
It's got to be.
Yeah.
Yes, something very different from what we've got. Something which doesn't put up scientific journals. Yeah, I mean, all sorts of different thoughts. And of course, the fact that now we live in towns and we don't see all
Is it still going on, still happening and developing in ways that we will not at this stage be able to comprehend? We'll talk a bit about that. I mean, it's kind of mad science fiction stuff. Have we guesses about could mind ever be almost totally disembodied?
Oh, I see. Well, I see no objection to that. Rupert Sheldrake's big on how mind extends beyond. And I think it's clear that mind does extend beyond our bodies. He's done some very interesting experiments about telepathy and about people being aware when they're looked at from behind, which suggests that our consciousness sort of spreads out in a way that, of course, physics can't talk about, but biology could, if biology could just get itself round to that frame of mind. Yes, I think that's perfectly reasonable. I really don't want to get into the question of are there some right, I don't know, but I mean, what we're talking about is the world that we actually inhabit. And what clearly goes on in the world that we actually inhabit is a great deal of this communication. Yeah, I mean, somebody's son dies in Australia, and on that very night, they have a dreadful dream, or something of this sort. And this kind of thing is frequently. It's not just, as they say, anecdotal. Something that happens.
It's a second sight. My mother always knew when I was ill, even thousands of miles away.
Right. Why should we deny these obvious facts? This is part of the world that we actually are in. But it frightens some people to admit that there could be anything outside what they can put down in the man. That they shouldn't be so frightened, I think.
Hasn't Richard Dawkins himself, in one of his exploratory moments, kind of guessed there must be some kind of intelligence behind this weird business that we're all part of. And the trouble is, it's become so associated with an external God kind of figure, a finger on the trigger. But the thing itself is almost impossible to understand except in terms of intelligence. And I don't believe in the traditional objective external thing, because that gets you off one bit of the regress, but then you have to ask, well, who created that, and so on. But the fact, I know this is not the kind of question you like. I once asked, I used to have conversations with Norman Kreitman, who was a brilliant Edinburgh psychiatrist with a very empirical mind, and I would be agonizing about why there's something and not just nothing, and he would say, there just is, Richard, bloody well get used to it. But there are people whose minds don't get used to it. I mean, they're just baffled by the fact that there is something and not nothing.
Well, yeah, I'm saying, I started by saying this, been talking about myself, that we have very different responses to these kind of queries and difficulties.
Yeah.
Some of us mind some things and others mind others. There are people, who have quite a big bet on that Dawkins will end up in the church.
Dawkins for Pope.
You're right, he does. We're in his thoughtful moments. See us, the rest of us can. No way of, and no reason to say that there isn't anything more than what we meet every day.
One mad final question. I mean, Bill Bryson wrote a typical Bill Bryson book about the universe, and this is what he writes, and you may just tell me to get lost with it, but it's the fact that we're told that everything came from what they call a singularity, the universe, and he says the singularity has been described as a pregnant dot hanging in a dark, boundless void. There is no space, no darkness. The singularity has no aroundness around it. There's no space for it to occupy, no place for it to be. Time doesn't exist, so there's no past for it to emerge from. What the hell is it? I mean, I mean,
I can't make sense of negations like that.
But I mean, what do you make of the Big Bang?
I don't make anything in particular.
It just happened.
Well, I don't know that. I mean, physicists just tell me so, and they tell me a lot of other things, and they often change them. No, I really have no views about this. Not the kind of thing I can.
No views about the Big Bang. It was a long time ago. Yeah. Well, I'm neurotic, of course. It's the kind of thing that keeps.
People who worry terribly about this.
Yeah. And it does keep certain religions in the business because they, of course, know what came before the Big Bang, which was the big fella. But let's move to questions from the floor. We have some roaming mics. Are you happy to take questions now, Mary? Yeah.
I'm deaf, so you'll have to.
Yep. Okay. We do have mics, and I can maybe repeat the questions if you don't get them. Could we have the lights up a wee bit so that I could see? And we have two, I think. Where are they? Yeah, there they are. They're coming down. We've got a few minutes for this. So who would like to go?
Somebody start.
There's one there. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you for such a wonderful presentation. But I wanted to ask you, you're saying that it's the scientists who are promoting the idea of materialism, but lots and lots of philosophers that I meet are physicalists, which is just another name for materialists, right? And it's almost like people who even want to talk about the idea of substance dualism, they'll actually tell me, don't tell anybody that that's what I think. So what are your thoughts on, I mean, obviously Cartesian dualism doesn't work, but there is a theoretical view, non-Cartesian substance dualism, promoted by E.J. Lowett Durham. I don't know if you know of this position.
I'm not sure I can get it, but it's a non-Cartesian dualism. The fact that there could help me here. I mean that there could be a kind of duality that scientists don't accept. That's not just the objectivizing one. Self and body. That the self somehow might yet still transcend the body, so that there might be that which is, but it's not just intrinsically and absolutely material. Is that something like that?
Well, I don't see any reason for manufacturing a new kind of dualism. I think it's important to get rid of the one we've got. Because if we think of ourselves as consisting of two separate things, we cannot operate as...
That's not the view. Sorry, that's not the view, but I don't want to...
Okay. It is quite difficult doing a kind of three-way thing. Is there another question that I might understand more in order to translate? And yes, up there, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Quick question. Gaia, the notion of Gaia, I think, provides a lot of great benefits, particularly in light of ecological crises, this sort of thing. I was wondering whether you could articulate some of the problems that a notion of Gaia might have for individual human freedom.
Great question. Any problems that the hypothesis of Gaia might have for individual human freedom? Big question.
See why it should make any. I'm not talking of Gaia as a machine which makes everything happen. Machines threaten freedom. I'm talking of Gaia as a whole within which all sorts of different organisms and creatures operate, each on their own initiative. It's self-regulation. I think you must be thinking that I'm treating it as a machine which makes things happen. I'm not.
But it might. Let's keep this one going. But you might be able to treat it not as a machine, but as an organism that we are a part of. That would still lose our freedom. Would you like to come back with a supplementary here? Yeah.
I mean, I think you mentioned the analogy with an ant insect as a type of collective mindedness, and you could conceive of humanity as contributing to Gaia in individual freedom, but with a type of collective mindedness that still causes problems, even if you don't see Gaia as a machine, but as a living organism. So how do we treat the tension between contributing to this larger whole, in which we're all contributing to things, and getting that wrong, obviously, at times, while also maintaining a distinct area for human freedom?
You're having a rather odd idea of freedom, I think. There's complete disconnectedness. I mean, suppose we say you're part of a group of people who are trying to do something together, say build a new village or something. What you can do is severely limited by what other people can do and what they want to do, but that doesn't mean you aren't free. You are free to work with them or between them, as it were. We always have a limited scope, don't we? In the world which contains all sorts of other people and other beings besides ourselves, we always have a limited scope, but we still do have that scope. And if you see the person next to you has a cart which is falling steadily, gradually into the pond, you have a choice whether to help them get it out or to go away. And every organism has a choice of that kind. I don't see any threat. I mean, what does one mean by freedom? One does not mean being entirely without influence or without constraints around one.
So there's no absolute freedom. Are you happy to leave it there, sir? Yeah. Yeah. Who else? Who's? Yes. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, you spoke earlier a bit about universities, and I'm quite inspired as an aspiring academic by your unconventional career path. Do you have any more thoughts or words of advice for young and aspiring academics who are nervous about entering into this whole marketized, institutionalized university rigmarole?
Now there's a great political question. Did you get that?
Moral and political question, yes indeed.
Yeah.
You have to sort of study it and understand it so far as you can. And it certainly is one of these contexts which can greatly limit people's freedom. And I don't think I can give them an idea in one of what to do about it. I'm jolly glad I haven't got to contend in today's problem employment market. But it's a question of the same kind, you see, that given certain limitations on human life, certain constraints, how are we to understand this with a view to doing as well as we can, as little badly as we can, to find a kind of way of working out. And then what's always happening is that we're trying to do what people have been doing a little time before, but you can't do it now, and one feels helpless. We are often helpless in ways that we very much would like to.
How would you advise a young academic coming into university life in this kind of overwhelmingly marketizing imperative? I mean, how do they keep both a job and integrity?
Well, I mean, I do know a number of people whose way of dealing with this is to get away from universities and do it on their own, so to speak. And this would involve understanding things like social media, you see, which I don't understand at all. New institutions.
He will, I bet.
Yes. No, I mean, I think it's severe, and people do need to take this quite seriously. Yeah.
So would you like to come back a bit on what your own thinking about all this is?
It's quite interesting that the advice is stay away from universities. I'm currently thinking about which master's offer to take up. But the way I've sort of tackled it is I came out of my undergrad a little disillusioned and not really knowing what universities are for. And I've ended up responding by sort of doing, hopefully, a master's in looking into the history of universities and what universities are for. So that's how I've responded by throwing myself into this vicious circle. But it's one way. But I'm also really interested in methods of self-education and community education outside universities, and they're things I'm interested in engaging with in the future. So, yeah.
Yep. And I think there's one at the back. Tell me if I'm missing anyone, because there's a question behind. Yeah, quite a few here. Yeah. Thank you.
Hello. As a graduate a long time ago who's in the professional world, I'd just like to say that academia, for the sake of academia, is not necessarily, in my opinion, a good thing. In this country, thankfully, we still have free tuition, and I hope that more and more young people take that with the opportunity of advancing society, of advancing the world they live in, rather than just advancing themselves. But my point I'd like to make is that We've heard about philosophy, we've heard about religion, we've heard about morality, we've heard about science. I think, to sum it all up very simply, what we have is good versus evil. And what we're looking for is a society, an environment where good wins. And that's not obvious today that that's going to be the end outcome. So all the learned minds who can help us go in that direction, I think we'd welcome their views as to how that could be achieved.
Excellent political speech, sir. And you all know how to vote in a month's time. I applaud that. So we're now going to hear from some women. Isn't it interesting? Most of the questions do come from men. Men are good at explaining, aren't they? Yeah.
Hello.
Yep.
I'm married to one whose mission in life is to tell everyone how to live their lives. I think it's genetic.
Yeah.
It's lovely to see a kindred spirit. A friend and I were thinking just recently, looking back, because like Mary, I have seen quite a number of years. And we were debating whether the progress that mankind has made in the last 70, 80, 90 years is primarily mechanical and physical, or whether there's been any spiritual progress, and I'd like Mary's comments.
Mary, interesting question. Progress, if you use that word, has been largely mechanical, objective. Has there been any spiritual progress in the human sphere in your lifetime?
Oh, well, I think there always is spiritual progress in that new ideas are being had and are being gradually expressed. There's a bit of a problem raised, isn't there, by, oh dear, who's that fellow who says there's less violence than there used to be? Yes.
Pinker.
Yes, Pinker.
Yeah.
Yes, people are behaving better. And he's got a case, in some ways they are, but not dramatically better. They still behave pretty awfully a long time. I think it does seem to be perfectly possible for humans to progress, both sort of locally and sometimes on a larger scale, if they all make an effort, and it does happen sometimes. But you can't depend on it, so to speak. It's not, and people do sometimes treat evolution, as it were, as an inevitable process of, sloping upwards. I don't think it's like that. But it's not a hopeless one either.
No.
So I don't feel moved to generalize.
I'm intrigued that two of the most fluent philosophers in Britain at the moment, John Gray and A.C. Grayling, are exact opposites. One's a complete pessimist and the other's a kind of rhapsodic progressivist, and that they're both writing interesting books that cancel each other out and keep a kind of equilibrium.
I'm not a philosopher, and so possibly a good deal of what you've been saying has been going over my head, but I am familiar with the notion of Gaia, and I'm also kept awake in the small hours of the night, to my great despair, over the whole issue of global warming and the ultimate outcome of that. And I wonder if either of you has thoughts about the philosophical implications of global warming in how we should be thinking about Gaia. And I'd also like to know whether either of you is sufficiently optimistic to feel that humanity is going to catch up in time to prevent what I see and what I think many see as a pretty ghastly outcome. Thank you.
Mary, a big question about global warming, which of course is the ultimate abuse of Gaia, of the way we exploit it. Are you optimistic that we might get it sorted in time, or do you think we're going to muck up our own nest?
I am not able to, I haven't got the facts to answer that in a general sort of way, but the simple answer, which a lot of people thought might work, is, oh, well, if there's Gaia, that's an insurance policy, isn't it? she will put things right. This, as Lovelock and Margulis and other people involved at once shouted, is not true. What Gaia is like, if it's an organism, if it's like a tree which is under attack with wind and pests and various similar things, it will do what it can to resist this, and it often does succeed in doing so, but it is not an agent for any single species such as us. It does not guarantee that we can be kept going at anything like the same level, and I don't think anyone knows. But I mean, this sort of topic, am I hopeful kind of thing, is it really is a matter of choice, and choice of policy, whether you will make an effort to treat it in such a way that something can work, or whether you will just say, oh, well, bother, I can't do anything, which is obviously one way out of any difficulties. I think it's that there is a real difficulty, consequence of how having been so jolly overconfident about our civilization for a long time, assuming that nothing really would go wrong. So our muscles are not in the habit of being adapted to try and deal with what does go wrong. There was a time a few years ago when there was a heat wave and a lot of people died in France. And quite a lot of people did begin to think, well, perhaps there's something in this. But then winter followed and they dropped back. I think that the future of the human race depends on what it is prepared to try and do, and how much that can work one can't have. Lovelock's latest book, I thought, was a comic about this. He says, well, we're in accelerated evolution. He treats all this extra civilization and technology that's going on. I don't think he always believes this, but he sort of tries this one out as simply more of the same. And he says, well, if you're going to arrange for a life, for the world to get hotter, then you'd better live like the insects. Termites arrange to have a nest within which they can keep to a proper temperature. They sort of have cooling arrangements. So we better all get into cities, and then perhaps it'll be all right. I don't think that he means this very seriously, but he answers that question. He says, that's what you better do. And I think this is quite an instructive answer. I mean, are we prepared to alter all our arrangements so that we have enclosed cities? If we're not, then we'd better do something on a larger scale.
Yeah, God, I don't fancy that. I'm going to draw this. I think I'm going to take one more question. Martin Rees, the astronomer royal, reckons there's a 50-50 chance that we can save the planet or not, depending on a lot of things, not only degradation of the planet, nuclear war. We're such a stupid species, we humans. I mean, the way we go on killing each other in more destructive ways. So I think the jury's probably quite out on that one. I think I'll survive the planet, but because I'm an old guy now. But it is actually quite worrying. And one of the things that most intrigues me, and I'd like to hear you on this, Mary, is the confidence of the climate warmer deniers. I mean, it's almost religious in its intensity, isn't it? And in fact, it's a matter of faith in certain political circles in the United States.
Yeah, they just don't like facts.
They don't like facts. Yeah. They watch Fox News. Yeah.
I think there's a quite interesting parallel to this. In the early 19th century, when people began to worry about the state of the slums and the factories and so forth, and not only did the The rich explained that nothing could be done about this, but the political economists explained that too, but unfortunately they softened it up.
Yeah.
But people like John Mill and Wilberforce and so forth wouldn't have it.
Yep.
So they thought, and they got the Factory Acts and all sorts of things, and there were dramatic changes. And it can be done, but we aren't in the habit of it.
Last question there, I'm afraid. Well, I'll give you two. There's one there. Yep.
Sorry.
Yep. No, we'll wait for the mic, sir. There you are. Yep. Yep. Thank you.
At the beginning, you asked Mary about her father. I would be interested to hear about her mother, and if she's got any view of the message from the Kogi people from Colombia, if she knows anything about that stuff.
Question about your mother and the Kogi people from Colombia. Do you know anything about... He'd like to know a little bit about your mother. I think he thinks I neglected her in...
I mentioned my father. Well, she seemed to have very sensible views, which on the whole were quite close to my father's. I mean, she married him being the man he was,
Yeah.
And they worked together. Yes, I'm sorry, I see she doesn't... it's less dramatic than talking about my father and grandfather, but it's obviously compatible.
Do you know anything about the Kogi people in Colombia? No.
Sorry.
Sorry? Yeah. Quite a sensible view, really. But one more, and then we're off. Is there one at the back?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you, sir.
Is there more scope for discussion of wisdom? And if there is, would that be helpful?
Is there more scope for discussions of wisdom, and would that be helpful?
Well, I think we do need more emphasis on that ideal and less on technological skill, going to the moon and all that. And people keep talking as though going to the moon was the best thing that people ever did. And that seems to be rather unbalanced. Yes. I suppose it's a matter of recognizing some wisdom when some comes up and kind of expressing it, isn't it?
Yep.
Yes, I think.
And being grateful for wise people like you and James Lovelock. So thank you so much for what you've given us tonight. Thank you.